Right. Just to conclude, in terms of the social infrastructure, before we go on to the physical, when paragraph P 1.4, necessary infrastructure will be required to be in place to support the timing of new development by adequately servicing the needs arising from such development. That's not. We haven't identified any specific constraints at this stage that affects the social infrastructure, affects the acceptability of any of the proposals.
No, but as Rachel has said, you know, I was surprised to hear Andy's information, because this time a year ago it was at capacity. But that's as it is. But it simply demonstrates that capacity goes up, or attendance goes up and down. And
that's right.
5 years from now, it could be a different situation.
And that is, and I suspect, because of the reality that you can't look at individual schools, you have to look at the overall supply of school places across the district or whatever, and the capacity of the education system, rather than the number of people in a village and the number of people in the local school. Because it may well be, I mean, my kids, I lived in a town called Petersfield when the kids were growing up, and my kids went to the school in Langrish, in the adjoining village, because they had capacity, and that was depending on how boundaries are drawn and such like. So that there are no capacities in terms of additional shops that are required to be built, or additional leisure facilities or public open spaces required as a result of development being proposed. There's no capacity issues there at the moment.
I don't think we can provide evidence. Villagers would say there's an ever-decreasing amount of facilities in Watton, but I don't think that's a subject for today.
Okay. Can we now look at T19 and the specific infrastructure improvements that you are looking for? Are you looking for these to be resolved full stop, or are you looking at them as a result of the new development?
I think we're looking at them to be considered. We're not putting them as policy measures. We're saying when a developer and when a decision maker is considering this, you know, look into these factors if they are relevant to a particular site. So flow of water from Mashua is relevant to quite a large area of the parish. Watercourse and drainage ditches will come on to, but it's eminently possible.
There is not a developer requirement, is it? It's not a developer to say you can't develop in the village because the county don't look after the ditches.
No, there are specific site allocation requirements in certain cases for a developer to improve watercourses local to their site. But again, it's the cumulative effect. If those things are never looked at, this is perhaps it's a prompt to county, to the development management team, to open up a discussion with the developer as to whether there are opportunities to address some of these issues via contributions.
Right. Can I ask, Rachel, I want to ask Andrew about the contributions and such like. Rachel, do you want to come in before that?
I just wanted to say that national planning policy and guidance is clear that
it invites neighbourhood plans to provide this role to identify the infrastructure requirements needed, the infrastructure issues within a neighbourhood plan area. And in a way, I was about to say, from that perspective, it complements the local plan policy about when Section 106 contributions are required. Well, there's two slightly different stories. One is the local plan requires of all major development proposals Section 106 contributions, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be necessary to require them of smaller developments. Each case we looked at on those site-specific circumstances. With regard to the list there, the neighbourhood plan itself does address the amenity land issue, access to public open space, through one of the site allocations. The drainage issue is the subject of a detailed engineering report supporting this neighbourhood plan, and there has been, well, I call it like a spin-off work that's resulted from the work of the neighbourhood plan, that the local flood group are looking at the different causes of the flood incidents and planning, and the management of surface water from new structures is a contributing factor to that. So these are issues that all come together. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight those points.
Okay, thank you. Is not the reference in the MPPF to the infrastructure required to allow the development to take place, or is it to address existing deficiencies in the area?
So I'll just the paragraph. I'll give you the paragraphs that I was referring to. I'll just turn around and get my plan. But do you want to? Shall I come in after you?
Yeah, I was going to say, Andrew. Yes, I was going to ask. Does Bretland have a sill scheme?
No.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. You haven't introduced SIL, no.
So, how do you deal with developer contributions? Is it do you have an SPD or just local plan policy, or how do you do it?
We have the local plan policy INFO2, which covers major developments.
Right. Is that because why did you use the threshold of major developments? Is that in accordance with Secretary of State advice?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. And is it not a consequence of the neighbourhood plan identifying lots of small sites, means that you're not able to negotiate Section 106 agreements for for community facilities, for example?
Again, Chris Hobson might be able to help me out on this, but that's my understanding. Clearly, any development has to, any requirement from any development is to meet the needs of that development, and not existing deficiencies that there may be in social or physical infrastructure. So that's sort of the starting point. Chris might be able to advise on minor developments and 106s, but my understanding is that we don't.
Yeah, that's correct. I can only just repeat that. I suppose the issue here from the neighbourhood plan group is, is that a lot of those sites, as I said in our comments, fall below the threshold that we have for securing the planning obligations, as Andy has said.
Right.
Can I just say here, all of our allocated sites are put forward by local people who want to do what's right for the village. They're not just opportunistic developers. So, hearing what you say about your ability to perhaps enforce S106, I wonder if you still would have an opportunity for a friendly conversation with such people who have hinted and may well be willing to make such contributions, whether the legislation requires them to or not.
So are you saying the policy should be worded about encouraged to to support local infrastructure rather than required?
I find it difficult to respond immediately to that one.
I mean, what the situation is that you've got a local plan that says if you've got a site more than 10 units, that they are required to make obligations, enter planning obligations to make financial contributions to the improvement of local facilities. You have chosen to allocate a number of sites which are below the threshold, which would not trigger that requirement to raise funds to improve local facilities, and therefore, are you saying that the policy one should be one of, rather than required to put the necessary infrastructure in place, what they should be is encouraged to contribute. All development should be encouraged to contribute to social infrastructure.
Well, without wanting to put her on the spot, could I ask Rachel to answer that for me, because I'm struggling a bit.
Rachel?
Yeah, sorry. So the local planning authority is constrained by the tests for planning obligations and conditions. So they can only be sought where it's necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms, where it's directly related to development and fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to the development.
Yeah.
National planning policy also, so that was paragraph 56. So it's not my role to educate people here, but so that is the problem that we're the challenge that we're all faced.
And that's why I'm asking the question.
But paragraph 54 says that local planning authority should consider whether otherwise unacceptable development could be made acceptable through the use of conditions or planning obligations. So it doesn't say it can only happen on major applications, but the local plan says it will happen on major applications where those three tests have been made. I think the point I was making earlier about the role in neighbourhood planning in identifying the infrastructure requirements comes to planning practice guidance. Paragraph 46 says a qualifying body should set out and explain in their draft neighbourhood plan the prioritised infrastructure required to address the demands of the development identified in the plan.
It's to address the demands arising from the development. So what development needs to take place to enable that development to happen?
Yeah.
And what I haven't been able to identify so far this morning is what infrastructure needs to be put in place to allow that development to take place. I haven't heard that you need to do this to allow something else to happen.
Okay. Let me, sorry, Rachel. Let me point to T1.9H, which is a very real problem in the village. Backflow of sewage.
Page 28.
Page 28.
Yeah. H, yeah. Measures. Yeah.
Backflow of sewage. That is a problem that is occurring in the last two weeks on developments, completed in the last 3 years. So clearly, whatever measures were applied to those developments did not prevent that problem, which is very traumatic for the villagers affected. So we would like to make sure future developments do not give rise to such a problem and other things like it. So I think, having heard what Rachel has just explained, I believe P1.4 should continue to say required. The developers may be these good-hearted local people who have put the sites forward. They may sell the land on to an outside developer who is not so good-hearted, and therefore, the word encouraged will suggest to that developer. I can if I'm feeling in a good mood, but I don't have to, so I'm not going to.
Okay. Okay. And just if you say to that, if that developer was to say to Chris, when his planning officers asked for it, that those contributions, how does it meet the three tests that Rachel quoted, i.e. it is necessary to allow the development to take place, is directly related to the development and is appropriate in scale and kind to the development. Should the developer is required to provide the drainage required to meet the Anglian Waters foul drainage requirements. If that is inadequate, that's not for the that's a question for Anglian Water rather than for the planning authority.
But if that development will result in the problem I highlighted, surely it is not appropriate development until that problem is fixed.
No, it could be appropriate development with inadequate drainage. And that's not a question for the planning authority, who that's a question for Anglian Water.
Okay,
Take the drainage people.
Take the same two new developments that have added to surface water flood risk both on the site and in the adjacent area. Now that shouldn't happen if they met even national policies, but the fact is it has happened. So those developers, to my mind, did not adequately show that their sites would avoid flood risk, but they...
Oh, no, that you're talking about infrastructure. The discussion at the moment is not over the adequacy of surface water measures, it's what infrastructure you're requiring to be made. The development is dependent upon which infrastructure is being put in place. That's the discussion at the moment.
Yeah, but drainage is part of infrastructure.
Yeah, and what the suggestion is that the developer puts in appropriate flood surface water attenuation measures so it doesn't result in development flooding elsewhere, and that's perfectly legitimate because that's meeting the requirements of its own development. What I'm suggesting is that your policy one is related to the social and physical infrastructure to be in place to require the development to take place, and that affects the timing of the development.
I think it's perhaps simpler than it's being perceived. We're saying, where applicable, demonstrate the availability. I've mentioned that can be a simple process. And in 1.4 we say, yes, we say required, but we say necessary infrastructure. So the developer has a look at the availability. He says, community facilities isn't applicable to my case. This isn't, that may be. I've looked into it. As a result of my review, my stance is that no infrastructure improvements are necessary. I rest my case, and Chris and Co look at it from that point of view. So he's not necessarily being forced down a road of providing anything. He just needs to take it into account and justify his site in respect of what is or isn't being provided.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm going to move on now from that. In terms of the way that the level of prescription on the allocation sites is the... I just want to get it in front of me. Question for Chris. To what extent could a scheme that has a different mix of unit sizes affect the numbers that could be accommodated on a site? If, for example, there was the policy says, I don't know, think of a figure, 12 units, say. If it was 12 one-bed units, it would have a lot different impact than 12 four-bedroom units. How much, by being very precise as to the number of units, are you not encouraging applications to come forward for larger development rather than what you're looking for, which is for the smaller developments?
If that criterion were taken in isolation, that could be the result, but that is not what the plan sets out to do. If you go to either the allocation policies and certainly policy 2E, that very much guides the size of dwellings in line with the parish housing needs assessment. So, and it shows why, contrary, different to the district needs, Saham needs are for smaller homes. So if a development has 12, 15 houses, is expected to already give a good mix of smaller properties, regardless of what you just said. Now, we didn't go the whole hog of saying you will provide 12 one and two bedroom houses, because the advice we had was that could restrict viability. Now, Rachel will come in a minute if she can advise, but I'm not clear how a policy could be worded to allow the flexibility you're suggesting without also allowing the possibility of an unlimited number of additional houses, which is the way I've understood the question of should up to X be changed to at least X.
Okay. And I'll ask Rachel to come in. I just want to paint a scenario. If we have later have a discussion on the choice of sites and identifying sites which include a risk, an element of risk of flooding, if you were to make better, more efficient use of smaller sites, you might not then need to be allocating sites in areas that could be at risk of flooding, for example.
That's for detailed discussion of flooding, because the site allocation process has looked in great depth at this problem before allocating sites that are in areas at risk. We've gone fully through the sequential test. We of course.
I'm just trying to square the requirements for developers to make efficient use of land, a policy that seeks to cap the level of development, but where there is flexibility in terms of housing mix. For example, 2E on schemes more than 10, it only talks about a scheme including 1 and 2 bed houses, and the majority of being 3 or less. That means the other half could be as large as you like and still be in compliance with the policy, rather than saying the numbers the numbers of houses on each site will, to a certain extent, depend on the size of units that are being promoted, for example.
Yes, but as I said, we've had to take into account representations, particularly from the council, on restrictive policies. I think we would have loved to say site X will have only 2-bedroom bungalows, but it was made clear that was not a good approach to take.
No, but by saying that you can only have you can't have 2-bedroom bungalows, but by saying you can have only 10 units on the site and no more, you are encouraging a developer to apply for the most valuable planning consent rather than actually achieving the same value with more smaller units.
Yeah, there's other considerations there. More units spread out more will impinge on all the various other factors such as flood risk areas, landscape impact, heritage impact.
Well, I mean, you have got some small sites which you will allow, say, up to 3 units, and that you could be a situation where someone puts one very large executive house and it would be complying with policy.
Okay, again, I go back to, this started with the landowner proposals. They proposed a number of houses. The site allocation and selection process, in a few cases, very few, reduced that for a variety of reasons. But, the 3-house site I mentioned that has been approved, the landowner put forward 3 houses. The policy reflects 3 houses. The application that came forward was for 3 houses. And that application was approved. There was no criticism that it wasn't making best use of land. And I will ask Rachel to come in, but I think, again, I haven't, and I know it's not your task to do this, John, but it's my task to make sure that the plan does what it sets out to do. And I'm not hearing a mechanism whereby a larger number of smaller houses could be prevented from being a very large number of smaller houses.
Well, you have, there are design considerations, character, on-site constraints, all those matters. You could have within the same footprint of a 4-bedroom house, you could have 4 1-bed units, for example, in the same floor space, with the same spacing and everything else. You would achieve more units with the same level of impact, same amount of surface water runoff, and you may then be meeting some of the needs for the smaller units that you're actually looking for.
Okay, if there were a way to word that in policy, that might be acceptable. We couldn't find a way to do that in a way that didn't open up more development. But Rachel is asking to come in, and I think it's right that she should.
I'm sorry, I think I've lost.
Come in, please.
Yeah, sorry, John. Sorry, I should have waited for you, John. I've lost track of where this conversation is going. Your question, John, related to policy 2E, but we seem to be talking about the site allocations, or are we talking about the density? Can you? I'm struggling how to.
Right.
What it is you're asking right now.
My question is, the underlying issue, Rachel, is how prescriptive the policies in the plan are, and in particular, in terms of the allocations. And the allocations are saying no more, up to a certain number, or this site will provide X number of units, say 15 units for the sake of argument. My question is whether that, by giving a maximum, will, without actually specifying the size of the units, so a site with 15 units, if we didn't have policy 2E, could be 15 4-bed houses, but equally the same site could take 20 1-bedroom houses. So the issue is The underlying question is the level of prescription in the plan, and whether you are almost ruling out achieving the smaller units, and the concern from Chris's point of view is he is worried that actually by having a minimum number or up to or no less than or at least or whatever could lead to sites being crammed full of development. And I'm suggesting that actually you could achieve higher numbers with the same building footprint. And that was the question about a four-bedroom house having the same physical footprint as for one-bed houses, flats, apartments, whatever, which could help meet some of the housing requirements set out in Policy 2E. And so the purpose of the questions is how much flexibility is there within the plan, and how prescriptive, and could it lead to unintended consequences?
Yeah, so in response to that, it is not the intention for any of the site allocations to fail to deliver on smaller units. So if that's a failing, a shortcoming, that needs to be addressed through the wording of those site allocations. The policy, so at a previous iteration, the site allocations did include criteria relating to housing mix. And going back to the earlier conversation, we talked about, can you just deal with all of this in one policy? There was a process of that going on, so it's all gone into the housing mix policy, which requires the of any development to be acceptable must be contributing to delivery of smaller homes in the parish.
Yeah.
The prescription where this individual site allocations say up to a certain number is supported by detailed evidence on the site assessment process. The intention overall in everybody, as far as I understand, and it's for the parish council to correct me here, is not for, the assumption is it will be delivered up to that number rather than less than.
But a proposal that came in for 1 unit on a 3-unit site could not be, it would be compliant with policy.
Well, that is not the intended or the intention of this plan as a whole.
But it's a consequence of the way it is written at the moment.
Right.
Surely it would, such a example.
So
Sorry,
is the answer
Rachel.
to respond through the wording of the site allocations or through revisiting the wording of Policy 2E? I think that is a question.
Well, you see, if I was looking at the site allocation policy, you've prepared master plans and saying the site can only be accommodated with this and it delivers this number of units. If I looked at some of the layouts and within the floor space of the buildings that deliver 8 units, 10 units, whatever, I was to actually subdivide those units into smaller units, I would then be delivering more homes than the policy will allow. And that's why the consequence of the way the plan is done means that it's driving to larger properties rather than smaller properties.
Okay, couple of things there. The master plans, of course, don't apply to every site.
No, but
and they clearly don't go into sufficient detail, and nor should they, to define the floor space of the properties they talk about. So the starting point to say I've got a certain floor space assumed, but I'm going to divide it in a different way, has no basis for the developer. What floor space is being talked about? A 4-bedroomed house could have any number of floor spaces. So there's no starting point to say I'm going to, we can't have a criterion that says within the existing floor space, because that doesn't exist in any shape or form. So that's a worry, I think. And you know, sorry, John, just to answer your other point about what if a development with one house came along, it would automatically be accepted. I think it would probably fail on density criteria, depending where it was. But also, I feel sure I'm right, in an earlier iteration of the plan, we actually stated a precise number of houses, and the council made a representation on that, and that's how we involved. And I won't swear to this because I need to look up the representation, but I think it was the representation, perhaps, to change that to up to.
Okay. Right. I can only examine the plan as submitted rather than the plan as was. Rachel.
Yeah, just on the master plans that have been provided. There's a master planning report submitted alongside this neighbourhood plan. Yeah, that provides the site analysis, or identifies the constraints, and there are significant constraints in terms of landscape, in terms of ensuring no sites at risk of surface water flooding are included, no areas of land within the developable part of each site, and that has itself directly influenced the layout of proposals. These numbers or proposed layouts haven't just been plucked out of the air; they've been subject to independent work.
I understand that, but if you, I've just had the plan open on policy 2H, which is Grange Farm, and that says on a 1 acre, just over a hectare site, you can build up to 10 new dwellings. Now, 10 dwellings per hectare is pretty low density. It then goes on to say that the proposals must be guided by the master plan layout. If I look at the layout, it is showing properties in detached and semi-detached houses. If some of those houses were actually flats, say, then the proposal could still follow the principles of the master plan, but deliver a higher number than 10 units. And that's the issue about the level of prescription.
Okay, so point accepted. The supporting text that particular policy, as in all the site allocations, explains the approach to density, which I'm sure you've read, but policy paragraph 2th.23 on page 74 explains that approximately 0.42 hectares of the site area is dedicated to green areas for the flood risk attenuation that is needed, and that was as part of the looking at that particular site. And then if you deduct the forms of the site access road, you're resulting in a housing density of 17.8 dwellings per hectare, and which cannot, which is in keeping to existing densities within the parish at the moment. But I'm not disagreeing with your overall point. About the opportunities for different layouts.
And the point I'm trying to make is that if you were to look at the layout that is at 17 dwellings per hectare of a developable site, within the same footprint and following the principles of the master plan, you could actually deliver more than 10 units, which you're prevented to by the wording that says only up to 10 units. So within the same footprint of those buildings, some of those could be a block of flats or elderly person units or whatever, and where one house is shown, that actually could be 4 units, and actually within the same master plan layout, it wouldn't be 10 units, it'd be 14.
So another issue that the Neighbourhood Plan Group has had to contend with is the feedback from highways, and particularly in this particular location in Saham Toney, you've picked on one of the sites, is the kind of crunch point about the overall numbers that highways would accept in that area due to constraints. So that's another. So the master plan report presented a number of options of layout of those sites, and one of the options was to look at higher numbers. But it's the transport work that fed into that. But coming back to dwelling sizes, it is a clear intention of the parish council that these deliver on smaller homes and are not opening the door for the building of large homes.
Okay, thank you.
Exclusively large homes.
No, I understand, and I understand. What Andrew?
Just from a local planning point of view and a DM point of view, sorry, Mr. Hobson, but doing well. If an application comes in on an allocated site for, as you suggest, 14 or 15 houses, which is an up to 10 or 12 in the policy, and there is no demonstrable harm from that development in terms of its any flood risk or any other infrastructure or capacity issues, we would be hard pressed to refuse it, just on the grounds that it's more than the up to 10 figure. So, that's our general concern around the up to figure, is that a perfectly acceptable and appropriate application at a slightly higher density or a different mix could well come in.
Can you offer any reassurance to the parish that by that flexible approach could lead to gross overdevelopments of these sites?
Well, we look at applications in terms of the layout, the density, the landscaping, and all the usual planning criteria, and assessing whether a scheme overall is appropriate.
Yeah.
John, you mentioned earlier that policy can't be changed that hasn't been consulted on. Now, I know the council made its representation on this subject, but the point I'd like to make is the villagers were also an important group of consultees. They've supported this plan based on the numbers in the plan. I have no remit to say today that I'm going to go against what they've told us over a period of years and go back to them when you've written your report perhaps and say, I'm sorry, but 70 doesn't hold good, it could be 100, it could be 120. There would be a riot in the village, and we would possibly choose to unallocate some sites. And I don't think that helps growth at all if we're put into that position. So I hear what Andy and Chris are saying, and I'm sympathetic to it. Really, we grappled with this issue, and we just couldn't come up with wording that left our plan with the certainty I outlined at the very start we want it to have, that the village wants it to have. I hear all the words about we, the planners, will take into account this and that, but that is uncertain. That is ambiguous. It's not.
And to be perfectly honest with you, Chris, all planning applications have to be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material circumstances indicate otherwise. And there will always be a degree of judgment on all planning applications, and that's just a fact of life, I'm afraid. I'm just once. Oh, Rachel.
I just wanted to highlight that there are other made neighbourhood plans and local plans. It's not the only practice, but it is accepted practice in certain circumstances to place an exact figure on the numbers to come forward on certain sites. It's still not the most standard practice. I just wanted to highlight that it is something that's been examined and accepted in the past, where it is informed by evidence through the site assessment work. Just wanted to raise that.
Okay, yes, I understand that, and equally, plans deal with it in a number of ways. Some will, and this is something we'll probably come on to in a minute, but it was the figure of 70 arrived at in terms of that was the capacity of the sites that had come forward, as opposed to how many houses does the village need to provide in going forward, and then finding the sites that to meet that number. And then is there a mixture of that number being met either through allocations or windfalls, for example?
Okay, so the
Rachel, I'm going to ask Rachel to come in first on that.
So, yeah, no, Chris will want to respond to this because he can give the backstory, but I just want to confirm that my response earlier was relating to the wording of the site-specific allocations, including those caps on the site-specific policies. There will always be infill development, there will always be windfall development, and the plan doesn't as a whole put a cap on that, it can't do.
That's helpful.
What it does, it takes a more restrictive approach than HOU04 on development outside the settlement boundary that is not in an allocated site, and justifiably so. I'm wandering into a different topic, and I think Chris needs to come in and explain the 70 number.
Yeah, so the starting point clearly is the 33 minimum target for Saham Toney. You perhaps have seen the evidence document whereby we felt that should actually be 48 because of some quirks of the local plan timing. So we, as I said, looked at all of the 18 sites that came forward with no preconceptions. Now, no villager would accept this as a concept. I would never sell it to them, but in my mind alone, if all of the 200 plus houses had come through the process as sustainable, I would have tried to make a case to the village as to why they should be accepted. I would have inevitably failed, but I would have tried. But it didn't happen like that. So we then, and Andrew can go through the process in a bit more detail if you think that would be helpful. But, you know, we looked at each of the sites with regard to the constraints that came out of assessments by ACON, the Flood Authority, Anglian Water. We took those into account. We then looked at I'll call them constraints applied by the sustainability objectives in the local plan. We looked at the policies of the local plan and the emerging policies of the neighbourhood plan and what it was reasonable amongst those to assess a site against. Some things obviously wait for a planning application. We gave some weight to the different criterion, and we went through a very extensive, comprehensive process of deciding, in essence, a score for each site, a ranking. And our process had established that if a site had a positive rating, it was sustainable. But in reaching that rating and that conclusion, in a few cases, we had to either reduce the size of a site and or its capacity. Site 7 is a good example. As proposed by the landowner, it had a significantly bigger area, as the site selection report shows, which the lead flood authorities said to us that risk building on a direct flow path in an area of high flood risk, we would not support that site to that extent. So we reduced it to avoid that area. And that's just one example, you know, the sort of factors that Rachel talked about and Andrew can go into, the heritage, the landscape, the drainage, any item that falls under what I've termed as the local environment in my initial words about the balance in the plan were all taken into account. So it simply happened. There was no preconception that 70 was right. After going round and round this process, 70 was the number that resulted. And our view has always been is if the process was correct and nobody has challenged it, then the answer must be correct. And that's how we went forward with 70 houses.
Okay.
Would it help if our Andrew outlines the process a little more?
I want to stick on the number at the moment.
Okay.
Chris, can I ask Andrew from Brooklyn, the local plan refers to the 5% figure. There's a couple of issues. Is the 5% increase of 5% of houses that are built adjacent outside the settlement boundary but adjacent to it more than the 5%, or does that include the 33 figure include windfalls sites that take place within the settlement boundary? And secondly, has the District Council, Bretland, got any concerns regarding the figure of 70, which is, significantly above the indicative? And in that, I know it's not a question, the wording uses significantly exceed 5%. What does that actually mean? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. The 5% is the number of dwellings within the settlement boundary,
Right.
not within the parish, within the defined settlement boundary of Saham Toney village, if you like.
Right.
And the interpretation that we have applied to that is that contributions to that 5% could be dwellings anywhere within the parish. So the 5% doesn't have to be made up of new dwellings within the settlement boundary. They can be made up of sites within Saham Toney parish.
Right. So the fact that some of the neighbourhood plan sites are within the settlement boundary, are they counting towards the 70, or is it only the allocations that are outside the settlement boundary?
No, it'll be all. The 5% is a baseline figure at a certain date, and the 5% is then made up of new dwellings anywhere within the parish,
Right.
within or without.
Because the wording of the policy, it only I thought I copied it down. It is triggered by only the development that takes place adjacent to the settlement boundary, rather than so you could build any number of houses within the settlement boundary and it wouldn't trigger the 5% issue. Is that right?
Sorry, I'm a little confused.
Let me rephrase the question. The 5% increase, the 33, is if there is development that takes place within the settlement boundary.
Yeah.
Does that need to worry about the 5%, or is it only the development that is affected by HO4, i.e. development adjacent to but outside the settlement boundary?
The makeup of the 5% would be made up of dwellings within and without the settlement boundary.
Okay.
Appendix 5 of the local plan,
Right.
which you may not have seen, set out in more detail the methodology for HOU04, and that states, just reading it quickly, this includes proposals inside and outside of the settlement boundary, referring to the 5%.
But that's not the way HO4 is written, is it?
No.
Let me just see if I can get it in front of me. I'm having to look at it online because you haven't got a spare local plan lying around the office, have you?
I've got about 40 in the office.
Oh, you could get one of your people to put one in the post for me.
Yeah.
Here we go. Appropriate development will be allowed immediately adjacent to the settlement boundary, subject to being supported by other policies within the development plan, and where the following criteria are satisfied. It would not lead to the number of dwellings in the settlement increasing by significantly more than 5% on the date of adoption. So the trigger of that plan is appropriate only developments that lie outside the settlement boundary. Am I reading it wrong?
The way that we have used the policy since the plan was adopted, and is that development within the boundary that is development proposals within the settlement boundary that are appropriate and suitable, etc., are deemed to be in principle acceptable.
Yeah. So you can,
irrespective of the 5%.
To exaggerate for effect, you could have 100 units inside the settlement boundary, and it would not trigger the concern about the 5% increase. Because
it would form part of the 5% increase. Although you're right, because it's within the settlement
boundary. That's right.
Yeah.
It's only, the 5% is only triggered by a development that's outside the settlement boundary.
Yes, but it yes. Let's just leave it there. Yes. Yeah.
Chris, because some of the housing allocation in the plan is development that is taking place within the settlement boundary, but is being used to against the 5. It may be an academic point, but it is being judged against the 5%, i.e. it's 70 as opposed to 33, when it may be actually, it might be 55 against 33 or whatever.
Okay. First, to clarify, our understanding and use of policy HOU4 is exactly as you set out, that the 33 relates to development coming outside the settlement boundary.
Yeah.
And that's why in policy 2C and B, we allow, I won't use the term unfettered, but we don't put limit on the numbers within the settlement boundary, and we see that as additional to the 33.
Yeah.
Now, site allocations, of course, they serve a different purpose other than just meeting a number. And it's perfectly valid to allocate both within and outside the settlement boundary. The fact is, of our allocations, you've got site 9 is partially within the settlement boundary, delivers 3 houses, and site 15 equally is partially within the settlement boundary. Given the way it's inevitably going to have to be laid out with respect to the highway, it's arguable that none of those houses themselves will be within the settlement boundary, but let's say half of them are, half of the 6, that's 3. So we've got, say, 6 houses within the settlement boundary and 64 outside. So we've well exceeded even our own target of 48. So I think on that issue we've dealt with it properly.
Okay. Can I go back to Andrew and ask the second part of the 3 points, which is, does the council have a concern about the level of development that could be deemed to be significantly above the 5%, and should I be looking at it under the heading neighbourhood plans can allocate more development than the local plans anyway?
Yes, I would concur with your view on that. I think in principle the council is supportive of the neighbourhood plan, the positive nature of the neighbourhood plan and its approach. As long as the sites are, they've been through the tests, appropriate, suitable, etc. Clearly, notwithstanding the detail around densities and lease and delivery, etc., the principle of them, the neighbourhood plan taking this approach is supported. And as the policy manager, I have no issues around the scale of development being proposed when assessed against HOU4.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you for that. That's helpful. Rachel?
I just wanted to go back to the local plan and the problem, its challenge it's created, not problem, a challenge, the challenging context it places the rural settlement in. The policy says not significantly more than 5%, which is a really helpful starting point, but there are different interpretations of what significantly is. So the second point is, in practice, what happens if Chris Hobson gets an application? So say we don't have a neighbourhood plan in place. What happens in practice if a planning application comes in adjacent to the settlement boundary in Saham Toney, and that 5% has been exceeded a third of the way through the plan period? In practice, I'm not sure what the position is, and I think we found that kind of approach to be tested in other local plans as well. I mean, you might want to discuss that, you might not, but the point that I'm trying to make is, if you compare the growth that Saham Toney Neighbourhood Plan is trying to plan for to the growth that may happen anyway, but in an unplanned way, not taking account of key issues, surface water flooding, highways, so on and so forth, it just puts into the context of how much added development Saham Toney is really delivering.
I understand that, and the issue is whether the LPA consider HOU04 a strategic policy, and if it does, and there is a conflict, does your the neighbourhood plan policy trump HO4, and in a development management point of view, because it would be a more recently adopted policy? Rachel?
So, sorry, it's up to Brackman to say whether it's a strategic policy or not. We've treated Saham Toney Neighbourhood Plan as considered all the local plan policies, but conformity, it has to be broad conformity with the strategic policies and local plan. And we've just heard from Andrew Darcy that the principle taken in this neighbourhood plan he is comfortable with because it's compatible with the direction of the local plan.
Yeah, and in some ways there is always going to. I mean, you could draw from Andrew's response that an increase of 33 up to 50 does not count as significantly exceeding. In that he's comfortable with that. But the other point is that there is always going to be a degree of uncertainty, however you word the policy, when it comes to a planning application that prays in aid policy H4 that is not an identified site in the neighbourhood plan, and what weight is given to the respective policies. But the way the legislation is written is if there is a conflict between the two, that then the presumption should be towards the most recently adopted plan. But I'm not sure there's any wording that I could give that would do more. That, what I don't think you can do is say that this policy will override HOU4 if it is a strategic policy. I don't know who wants to come back in. I know Chris does. Andrew or Chris Hobson?
I'm happy for Chris to go.
Yeah.
No, I don't think in any way our plan seeks to sort of supersede HOU 04. It does boil down, as has been said, to that word significantly, which I'm sure if asked we'd all define in a different way. You know, if you talk about simple numbers, is 37 significantly more than 33? In my opinion, not, especially when you then take into account that we felt the number should be 48. But if you take it as a percentage, more than twice the number, some people, not I, would say that's significant. We took this up with, Chris wasn't with the council at the time, but one of his senior colleagues prior to an earlier consultation, because we just wanted to be sure of what's just been discussed, that by allocating, at that time I think it was 83 in the draft plan, would we be falling foul of HOU4? And the answer was very definitely no, we wouldn't be. So I don't think we're seeking to trump HOU04 in any way.
Rachel?
Yeah, I just, Chris is, notwithstanding what Chris has just said, Chris is also very clear that the neighbourhood plan does take a more prescriptive approach towards what happens edge of settlement that isn't in an allocated site than HOU04 does. And we're, just to confirm that, Chris.
Okay, you're right. I agree. I overlooked that. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I think I'm conscious it's 10 to 1. Question for Breckland. If Saham Toney through its neighbourhood plan is delivering 37 more than the 5% number, does it mean that other villages don't need to develop as much because of the need to, you know, the 5% add up towards a figure for villages, I guess. If one is actually helping out other villages take less development.
My interpretation of that would be that the plan sets out 5% targets, bad word, numbers for each of the settlements covered by HOU04 as separate figures, and that any applications that come in within a respective parish would be looked at against the figure for that particular parish, not for the total number of villages or the total number of all of the parishes under HOU 04.
Okay.
So the short answer is no.
Okay, thank you.
I just like listening to myself.
We touched on the 5-year housing land supply. What's the current figure for Breckland?
We published an interim figure based at October, and that gave us you caught me on the hop, it was over 6 years supply.
Good.
We will be updating that following the end of the monitoring year at the end of March.
Okay. And are there any plans? Your local plan was adopted 2019.
Yeah, November 2019.
Have you started work rolling forward? Are you looking to wait and see what comes out of the white paper in terms of that, or have you got new housing numbers coming out of the recent government announcements?
The current local plan was adopted. The inspector included a new policy in it that required us to undertake an immediate review of that plan.
Right.
One of the reasons given was the housing numbers. The current local plan is based on objectively assessed need derived locally, the old-fashioned way of doing it. And the inspector, and during its preparation, the standard methodology numbers started to come out, the 2014 based numbers. The inspector, instead of delaying the local plan's adoption, simply said, I'm happy with the numbers as proposed under the objectively local assessed needs, but because there is a new way of calculating these things now, you will need to do that as an immediate review. We started that review straight after the local plan was adopted in November 19. We stopped following the publication of the white paper because of the likely implications on the way plans are prepared and the content of those plans, and also because the government was reconsidering the standard housing number methodology. Now that the government have published its findings on the new housing numbers, we are going to start work formally on the plan again this year. I'm working on initial documents already, like the new timetable and corporate sites, etc., based on the new housing number, and that has gone up from 612 dwellings per annum, which is in the current plan, to 661 per annum.
Oh, that's good. I've seen some authorities that are a lot worse.
Oh, well, the original proposal was over 1,000 houses a year.
Wow. Yeah.
In the consultation documents. That's been reduced to 661.
Okay.
But that's obviously what we have to do, and we will roll them. So yes, we're starting an immediate review.
And have you had any thoughts, and I appreciate it's early days yet, about how you will treat areas with neighbourhood plans? Are you likely to wish to do a call for sites and allocations where there is a made local plan, or will you say we'll just leave it to the neighbourhood plan to do that?
As I say, very early days, as you say. What we will be doing is, I think we will be doing a general call for sites across the district. We will then also have to look at the existing allocations that we have in the local plan, especially the larger sustainable urban extensions in terms of their delivery trajectories, and that all of that work plus the new housing number will give us an idea of the sort of new allocations that we may be looking at, which in turn could affect the development strategy. It would lead to a review of HOU 04, for example. The whole plan is going to be up for review.
Yeah.
Just as an aside, we didn't like the appraise significantly more than either. It was appraised put in by the inspector at the examination. Originally, we had set 5%.
Okay.
So we are grappling with that interpretation as well, and it's a judgment call.
Yeah. Okay.
So, the local plan review will be a full review. Clearly, if the neighbourhood plan allocations remain deliverable and developable, the neighbourhood plan will clearly form part of that consideration.
Yeah. Okay. That is fine. And that hopefully just brings that topic to a close.